Welcome to New Hope Underground's Jesus Talk. Darin and Drew Hansen take on the subject of why people leave the church. Please look for our New Hope Underground episode, along with a Jesus Talk episode to follow each week. Thank you for your support. And now, here is Darin and Drew.
So we've been having, I think, some excellent conversations here on Jesus Talk here at the end of our podcast here lately.
Come on, that's just the standard for us.
I know, but it's even better. It's getting even better. We keep growing in, competence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at segues. So now I'm just trying to figure out content.
You're doing well. And I think it's funny that I said, we're trying to figure out, competence. I couldn't come up with a word. So therefore, I'm incompetent.
You know, I didn't even think anything about it. It's because it's so true.
Okay, well, you said you had an interesting conversation this week that happened to kind of go along with the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's not unique in terms of, this kind of happens often. I had a conversation with someone about my age, a little bit younger, but
okay.
Grew up in the church, great guy, loves the Lord, loves Jesus, wants to do the right thing all the time. He's not out to prove anything,
right?
But he had an interesting conversation because he felt he's just been struggling with some issues within the church, and so he talked about that with a friend of his who has become a little bit more conservative towards those things and way more fundamentalist potentially. And he just said, based off that conversation, he just never felt it just didn't go very well. Let's just say it like that. He felt like he wasn't loved in that situation.
Okay.
So we were talking about what it's like to be a Christian these days, and he says it's very hard to deal with the church because he often feels like he's in the middle, almost like he doesn't belong or something. He's in the middle. He's like, he's got a lot of people on his, I'll say for this conversation, on his right. And then he has a lot of friends who have just left the church altogether because of some of these issues. Where he's in the middle, he still loves the Lord, but there's some issues. So he's trying to figure out how to wrestle with those issues. His friends, instead of wrestling with them, just kind of leave the church. So he's torn,
Right.
If that makes sense.
So, I mean, trying to figure out, I'm assuming he's just trying to figure out, okay, how do I keep my friendships at the same time? Am I doing right by the Lord?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just basic.
And kind of bewildered maybe a little bit as to why other people are leaving the church?
Yeah, I think he's confused because he's grown up in church and he never really questioned things. And as he starts to question them, he's trying to figure out how to do that without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, what are some of the reasons his friends are giving for leaving?
Kind of typical reasons. I would say most people leave the church, and in his friend's case as well, leave the church because of hypocrisy within the church. That's obvious. Most people can relate to that at some point. Issues with leadership structure, leadership doctrine, leadership practice. And then there's social and cultural ideals that conflict sometimes with specific people in the church or with the leaders or with the institution,
Or the church may take a stand on particular social issues they don't agree with.
Homosexuality or something like that.
Abortion.
So instead of navigating that, well, sometimes they do, but a lot of times it just ends up with saying, "Oh, I'm going to leave. I'm done."
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it might be good for us to. I think what would be good for us to talk about a little bit is to take some of these reasons and just kind of talk through them.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I've struggled myself at times with just how emotion gets involved to the point of where logic kind of goes out the door. On both sides of that discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because it's in a very it's an emotional topic.
Right, and then you have to ask another question. Once you get through all this, you kind of plow through it. Is what about Jesus and how does that work? You know, like how does?
Yeah.
In other words, we automatically assume the church is synonymous with Jesus, and it should be, but that doesn't necessarily. It's not always the case.
Well, you got to break it down. What is the church?
Yeah, exactly. The definition and what does that person mean by it? Well, you know, who are they talking about? I mean, a lot of questions kind of come up. But when we take hypocrisy first, why don't you kind of explain that a little bit more? Even though I think people probably understand what you mean, but let's go ahead and go ahead. I know the word hypocrite or hypocrisy literally means a person who's like an actor, puts up a mask.
Yeah.
So.
I think that can sum it up quite nicely, but to bring it to a practical application, like down to earth, most people if you come to know Christ, you start. The average case is, you become very passionate about exploring more of what God has in store for you, exploring more of who God is, and you get the Christianese word for it is you get on fire for God, right? And you start going to church more. And you commit every ounce of your being to this idea of church and religion and God, and at some point, somebody who you've looked up to, you find out that maybe they don't really think they don't believe those things as much as I thought they did, or they did something where that they didn't practice what they were preaching.
Yeah, talk the talk, don't walk the walk.
Yeah, so I mean, you could break that down in a more specific case, but it happens all the time.
And of course, a lot of people point to these high profile.
Yeah, it's
people.
easy to do that.
One thing that's going on right now is Ravi Zacharias, who is just passed away a few months ago.
Yeah, we were just talking about that off air.
Yeah, it's just really crazy. Christianity Today has reported that there was some sexual misconduct there, and you just have to read it for yourself. But it really is amazing coming out after his death. But this guy's had a huge ministry for years, and a lot of really good stuff he's done.
Yeah, a lot of people have come to believe in God through his ministry and stuff. So
yeah, so you got to wonder, okay, how does that affect people who became believers? Or
it might shake some people.
Yeah.
It might. Because of some of the hypocrisy that is shown.
Well, Jesus hated hypocrisy. I mean, that was obvious in the New Testament. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, when you read Matthew chapter 23, when he goes off on the Pharisees and the other leaders who said one thing and did another. And he calls them out, word for word, like some really harsh language that he uses. So to hate hypocrisy is in line with the will of God. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's understandable to want to leave an organization that you've put every ounce of like your being into, your soul into, when you feel betrayed. Because that's ultimately what happens. People feel betrayed
by other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, by other people. Sometimes that means they don't leave their faith and they just leave the church, whether that's big C church or small C church. And it depends on the situation, I would say, whether or not that's the right call. But sometimes it just means forget everything and just say, oh, well, maybe before I was better without God, than you are with God. So
they're kind of like Gandhi, who said, if it weren't for Christians, I might be a Christian.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. There are a couple of things I think we got to talk about. One is when we think of hypocrisy, defining that is interesting. And here's the reason I say that. It seems to me to be fairly obvious what it is. And we just defined it, basically.
Right, when someone does something that is against the teachings of the church.
But I will say that there are some people who use hypocrisy as an excuse, to be flat out honest, to leave the church, when all they really mean is they don't agree with someone.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, you can have differing opinions and not be hypocritical.
Yeah.
So if you don't agree with somebody, it doesn't make them necessarily a hypocrite in that instance.
Right.
At the same time, when you're talking about real hypocrisy, which is I tell you I believe one thing, then totally do something else, I'm acting.
Yeah.
Then that, I mean, obviously that is an issue for today, as it always has been. And I always find it interesting that for some reason we only talk about hypocrisy mainly when we talk about church and not about other things in life. Because hypocrisy is true across the board in lots of areas of life.
Yeah, and just relationships. And
But when it comes to the church, I think this is a valid discussion, is why do people leave? Because they leave. I don't know. Well, how would you answer that with someone who's saying, I'm thinking about leaving the church
because of hypocrisy?
Yeah.
What would I say to them?
Because I have witnessed hypocrisy.
Yeah, I would say I understand. I've been there. I've wanted to do that too. So usually I have to, because this is not, I've had that conversation many times. I usually try to calm them down and get them to realize that their situation is not unique. Thousands of people have gone before you who are wiser, who are smarter, who are smarter than you with the church. So in terms of, just where they're at as a Christian. And so if you get them to calm down and realize, okay, this is somewhat normal, so maybe there's something to learn through it. You don't need to leave it all, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Just kind of calm down, and because it's emotion gets involved, and you kind of blow things out of proportion.
Yeah. And obviously it depends what's going on. If it's the preacher, the pastor, saying, just hateful things and saying he's all for love, but you find out that this is actually how he is as a real person, and it doesn't reflect Christ at all. And I think there's an issue there. Maybe you do need to leave that specific church or something, but usually I'd say 90% of the time, you're just making a rash decision based off
something you're angry about.
well, not even that. It's that you're angry about the fact that somebody's let you down.
Yeah, I think the thing I would say with people is, are you really surprised? Are you shocked by the fact that humans fail, that they're sinners? And actually, that's what church is about, isn't it? Being a bunch of people who are sinners.
Dude, maybe I'm cynical, but I've kind of been saying the last couple of years, like, nothing could happen in a church that would surprise me.
Yeah. Well, that's right, because
it's being ran by the people. Whole thing is made up of people.
Yeah.
Gosh,
and we fail miserably. Now, the scripture says Jesus is the head of the church, and ultimately, I want to know when someone says they want to leave church, I want to know what they mean by that. Because, like you said, it could be a local church that has some issues, and maybe you do need to leave.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I want to say, then what do you mean by church? Does that mean you want to leave your faith? I mean, you're going to leave Jesus, who's the head of the church? And if you believe in Jesus and you follow Jesus, you are the church.
Right.
So what do you mean by leaving the church? And most of the time, it always has to do, and you can tell me if you disagree, but I think most of the time it always has to do with something very specific, a certain experience. Yeah, a certain experience. Yeah, it has to do with a particular sinner they just didn't think would ever treat them that way. They still have a very high view of whatever that person should be, and it disappoints them so much that, and therefore, it must not be real.
Can I be cynical once more?
Please.
I think what a lot of people my age, especially men my age, big YouTube users, right? We love YouTube.
Right.
That's how we're exposed to different ideas oftentimes.
Yeah.
Can be great.
That's how I learned how to fix my car.
Yeah. Maybe I should watch that.
I've had to teach you how to use YouTube because I can't teach you how to fix a car.
Well, I think oftentimes people will struggle with these things, and they'll be like, well, I learned, like, they'll see some videos on YouTube right? And they'll be like, well, yeah, I think more like that, and there is hypocrisy out in the church. I saw this video, and then they'll apply that to their own church context. And I think that's where you need to be careful.
You're looking up media that is feeling the same way you feel already.
Yeah.
And they're propagating the same ideas.
Yeah.
So you got to ask the question, where's Jesus in all this? And, well, what do you feel about Jesus in that? Because I've got no problem with that discussion. It's just eventually that has to be answered, I would think, because ultimately we're talking about the church, the kingdom, Jesus, following Jesus, more than we are actually talking about the people of Jesus.
Right. And I think that's telling when you see people, oftentimes, I'm not saying all the time, but I'm cynical again. A lot of people will slowly leave the church, right? So usually the people who don't leave are people who are really plugged in, like really part of the church and what's going on. But the people who get more and more upset are people who have been kind of backing out for a while, who have said, okay, and maybe that's deliberate, but sometimes it's just ultimately I'm leaving the church because I don't want to be here anymore.
Well, I think the thing I would encourage is we need to close this up a little bit, but is that if you have those kinds of questions and you feel like maybe you feel like you're on a gradual slope in that direction, talk to somebody, find somebody you trust. I mean, there are people who actually are really trying anyway. I mean, no one's perfect. Everyone's a sinner, but at the same time, there are some people whose hearts are in the right place.
Yeah.
You can't just dismiss everybody for the sake of a few.
Exactly.
So make sure that you look that up, and we would love to talk to people. I'm not saying that we got it together, but we really are trying to follow Jesus. I
would just add on to...
Yeah, go ahead.
Add on to that real quick. Like, be open to... just be open whenever you talk about those things. Don't come in with the point. You know what I mean? Yeah,
be open.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because do we really want to be about Christ? We want to be about us. Hey, thanks for listening, and we'll be back. And we're going to address some of these other issues that we brought up as to why people leave church in the next Jesus Talks to follow. Have a good week.